Good evening and welcome to Screentone Club, episode 34. We are recording on the 30th of September 2019 and for release on the 1st of October 2019. For the first time in the history of the podcast, we are now both north of the border, and so this is now being renamed ScotchTone Club. Insert bagpipe music here. So yes, we've both moved north of the border due to jobs, frankly, but we're coming to you live to talk about manga and not square sausages? Question mark. They're everywhere. They're everywhere, Andy. It's so many. It's scary.
I'm not quite sure why the fascination with differing shapes of sausage, because I've come to learn that every shape of sausage is a good sausage, so it's all fine with me.
I think it's mostly an excuse to give you more sausages rather than other expensive things in a breakfast plate, so they can be like, here's a round sausage and a square one. Check it out. It's different. It's more stuff. And it's like, wait a minute, where's the bacon? But yeah, so we're both now for the border. We're recording this. I'm on a very bodged together setup. So let's get on with it before my internet collapses. So first and foremost, this is your manga podcast for the fortnight. I did introduce you, Andy, didn't I?
I don't think you did, but people probably know who I am by this point. So
okay, no, I should do this properly. My name is Elliot Page, again now north of the border, and I'm joined by my lovely co-host, Mr. Andy Hanley. How you doing, Andy?
Yes, I'm doing very well. I guess this is where we stake out our independence as a podcast or something.
I'm not going to go anywhere near that, frankly. So, if you like our podcast and want us to remain free and independent and completely and utterly free of weird advertising for bedspreads, please have a look at our Patreon. We have a Patreon where from this princely sum of $1 a month, you get bonus episodes. And our upcoming bonus episode, which we're recording shortly, will be on The Girl from the Other Side, which I'm quite looking forward to discussing because I think there's quite a bit to get into there. And you'll also get access to all our previous bonus episodes, including such hot bangers as Golden Kamuy and Land of the Lustrous. So, also a quick note on the Patreon front is a big shout out to Rob Jessup, who still continues to support us at the tip-top tier we have. Thank you ever so much, Rob. You are keeping the lights on, quite literally. And so moving on to the first part of our show is returning champions. So we've got some returning champions here, one from Andy, one from myself. I'm very curious about yours, Andy, because I have bought this but have not had time to read it with the whole moving house and life thing. So take it away, if you please.
Yeah, so over the weekend I managed to catch up with Our Dreams at Dusk. We previously covered the first volume on the show and then kind of did a bit of a Returning Champions bit on volume 2. As we mentioned then, it's only a 4-volume series, so we're kind of at the penultimate volume with volume 3. And yeah, much like the first 2 volumes, it is just really, really good. It does some interesting things because, the main kind of thrust of the volume, I guess there are a couple of main thrusts, one of which is basically a whole kind of story arc revolving around a transgender character, which is really interesting in its own right because it doesn't go down kind of the typical route of so many of these kind of stories where it's just here's how this character was bullied as a kid and all their hardships and here's what they had to grow up through to get to where they are now. Actually, this character was, actually pretty popular at school and, didn't really have any major problems. And kind of the main thrust of the story is actually kind of a former classmate who sort of stumbles across this person and is just oh, wait, I know you from school, right? And he's yeah, you do. Kind of expecting the worst. And it actually makes an interesting counterpoint to volume 2, which was kind of, a lot of it was about Tasuku kind of, trying to actually help somebody out with their own problems and kind of flubbing it in the end. And it's kind of, it really kind of gives Tasuku kind of a viewpoint of what he did through the lens of what somebody else is doing, because kind of this sort of old friend of the character in question is kind of trying their best to be kind of helpful and understanding and kind of supportive and sort of trying to be an ally, I guess is kind of the phrase that you'd use. And kind of become so overbearing in doing that they actually kind of become a negative influence on the person's life to the point where they basically have to say, look, please stop. I've got a handle on who I am and what I'm doing, and I totally appreciate where you're coming from and kind of what your point of view on all of this stuff is, but I don't need this. I am okay with making these decisions for myself, and, please butt out, basically. And it kind of gives Tasuku kind of a viewpoint of the events of Volume 2, where, he gets kind of too intricately involved in somebody else's problems and gets to the point where, like, he thinks he knows best, and kind of, he kind of sees that same blowback from another point of view and kind of realizes, like, okay, I kind of understand where I went wrong now, and actually kind of learn something valuable from it, which is quite kind of satisfying in its own right. And the other thing that this volume does is, of course, finally it kind of delves into to Tasuku's crush, Tsubaki. Those two characters get to spend a lot more time together, and we kind of get to see various kind of facets of Tsubaki's character, who clearly has baggage of his own around his own kind of worldview, which it seems is probably at least partly shaped by his family, and so on and so forth. And that does, again, some really great stuff. There are some fantastic visual allegories, much like previous volumes.
As again like before, I suppose.
Yeah. There are some really fantastic kind of single and 2-page spreads and kind of like bits of imagery that really kind of hammer home sort of the emotional state of characters at that moment in time, and kind of it's a really good way of sort of reframing the discussion, not just via kind of the words that are spoken by these characters, but also kind of via this sort of slightly kind of off-kilter kind of take on it. And so a lot of that stuff, like none of that really gets resolved per se. So that's clearly, I imagine, going to be the thrust of the final volume, is finally kind of, getting to the bottom of kind of Tsubaki's character, and whether he can kind of make some progress and some growth in his own way, because clearly he has some things that he needs to deal with that come to the forefront very much in this third volume. But overall, yeah, if you liked the first 2 volumes, this is also great. It does a lot of really good stuff, and I'm very keen to grab that final volume when it comes out and kind of see how it all closes off.
Yeah, totally. That sounds, it sounds exactly what I want out of that series, which was already very good and giving me exactly what I wanted to see. And hearing about having a transgender character who isn't transgender introduction 101 all over again is nice. It's nice that we're getting to the point of maturity where these sort of more in-depth, more earnest narratives, rather than, it's the tragic lesbian story 101, the tragic transgender story 101. It's you can totally let gay people be happy too, or people of any persuasion be happy too. They have more stories to tell, and hearing that it does the visual panache, some of the flair shown in Volume 1, I still think about, quite frankly, when you see Tasuku's heart, chest exploding. I still think about that panel quite a lot, because it works so well. It's such a good panel, because even though you know that's what's happening before it, when you get to that page, it's just really impactful, of just blam. Sorry, but yeah, it is this crazy, really impactful thing, and it's totally appropriate. It's not lurid, it's not stupid. And to hear that it continues into Volume 3, like I say, I've got it downloaded already, and if I can keep my eyes open this evening, I'll try and make that my bedtime reading, because it sounds real good.
Yeah, for sure. The other interesting thing kind of visually that this volume adds in a couple of places is there are a couple of moments where there's kind of things come to a head, and somebody kind of has an outburst, or kind of a moment of just okay, I've had enough of this shit. I'm gonna say something / do something. And in both of those occasions, the kind of paneling and the layout and the way those panels are framed is really smart, because you don't know who is having that outburst initially, and then it's a couple of panels later where you kind of get the drop of oh, that's the character that got pissed off at this moment, and it's not always who you expect. So it does some really interesting stuff with that, where you kind of it's kind of watching the kettle boil, and it's kind of reaching its boiling point, and you're just okay, this is going to spill over at some point, but then the actual kind of spillage comes from an unexpected source. And it's just, again, just a really smart use of the visuals to kind of sort of play into your own prejudices as the reader, of I know which character is going to be the one to blow up at this, and then be no, actually, there's more complexity to this than you're actually kind of than you actually know, and kind of here's the deal with it. And it's just like little moments like that again that, you know, they're not kind of the things that make the difference between this being like okay and good. Like, you know, there's far more to it than that, but they're just these little moments that kind of elevate it a bit further, like much like the kind of visual allegories that take something that's already impactful and kind of give it an extra kind of layer of intrigue or emotional resonance.
Yeah, I think especially that's really useful because the way you describe it there, it sounds like it's elevating the message and keeping it free of the actual person giving out until it needs to, or it knows how to twist. So that sounds fascinating. And everything about that series exists in this really fascinating state because I'm guessing with Volume 3 there's no more information on who Miss Nobody is.
She continues to be an enigma, and more disappointingly, there's still nothing more about our good friend Tchaikovsky and what his deal is. But his gramophone breaks at one point in this volume, which is kind of like heartbreaking. Like, oh no, you've taken away the one thing this guy likes.
Well, the one thing we've seen this guy do.
Yeah. It's like, I assumed that was maybe going to be the lead into kind of something about him, but then it's just like, by the end of the volume, it's like, nah, got my gramophone back, it's all fixed, this is cool, let's listen to some Tchaikovsky, and it's like, okay, I guess that's good. Yeah,
I get the feeling that almost that Tchaikovsky is almost there just to be maybe there'll be something about him in Volume 4, but I mean, I'd like something about him, but at the same time, he could just be a quiet anchor, which, you know, he's doing his own thing. But yeah, well, I don't know. I at this point, I trust the author completely. So, you know, again, like, I feel like I'm saying this a lot about series recently, but the fact it's a 4-volume compact series really encourages me because I've seen too many things go long and then fall over their face. So, whoops. This sounds amazing. So, hooray!
Yeah, it continues to be good. So that is good news indeed.
Cool. So in continues to be good news is my returning champion, which is Land of the Lustrous Volume 9. We did a premium episode on Volume 1 of this series. Go back to that if you're a Patreon subscriber to hear me gush about this series. But Volume 9 is like, we've gotten into the pretty intense moments of this series where there's an established cosmology and it's been upended several times, and the like phosphophylite suffering train continues to barrel past every stop sign that it can see. And frankly, just the places this series has gone now in this 9th volume, you think by now that it was, you know, it would be kind of running out of ideas, but it's now reached a kind of intense fever pitch where it's gone past several breaking points in the storyline of something's got to give, and the strife is still ongoing, but things have broken, and people are now, all the characters involved are having to figure out what they're going to do now that things have started to go really to the wall, in a number of really fascinating and kind of heartbreaking ways. Like, it's now gotten to a point where clearly there's going to be no perfect ending, and God knows what's going to happen or fall out from this. It has some really intense character moments. The main thing I'll say about this series, in this volume in particular, is, you know, you've had a lot of very sharp, distinct line work and off-kilter angles and very intense imagery of gems snapping and shattering and such, and this volume has it in kind of upsetting amounts of spades, if that makes sense, where just some characters are pushed to the actual limit of their own ability to comprehend. I mean, to use a tired phrase, they cannot even. Like, some of them are actually almost self-destructing in some manner because they cannot handle what's happening. And some wild stuff happens. It's really fascinating. And, of course, the only problem with this is that now I've read it, I'm jonesing St. Theatre Volume 10, which is already out in Japan. And, of course, I can't read a lick of it. So I just have to sit on my hands until next year when Kodansha release Volume 10. So good job, me.
Yeah, happy days. I mean, talking about kind of the ending, like, is there any indication of how close it is to an end point, or is it still got some way to run, do we think?
There is definitely an end state in sight. Like, it can end at some point. Like, enough questions have now been answered that there is going to have to be some kind of reckoning. but the questions have changed, and so it could keep going for however long it wants to, really, with just renewing questions. But with the set of problems it has, I think like volume 12 would probably be a nice ending point for it at the moment. It's getting to the point where enough questions, as I say, enough important questions have been answered about how the characters can extricate themselves from this situation, that there is an end point in sight, possibly.
Cool. Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of it is a case of, man, this is going to be grim. So we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, like that's, and I desperately need to kind of catch up because I'm still only like a few volumes into it. But like that is one of the things that I enjoy about that series, is that it does continue to kind of evolve and take turns, and as much as I remember kind of like watching the anime adaptation and kind of being a bit disappointed / worried when it takes its first big turn from like, hey, look at Foster Goofy Idiot, to like, oh, things are getting serious here. But like, I bought so quickly into that when it takes those kind of more sinister and darker turns, that I was soon very much on for kind of whatever it was doing. I mean, again, kind of talking about trusting the author at some point, like it was definitely one of those series where it got to the point where when every twist came along, it's like, no, I'm just on board with this. Like I trust that this is going to go in an interesting direction. And it sounds like it is continuing to do that.
So yeah, on that note, at this point there is still plenty of phosphophyllite suffering, but it's no longer affecting them. But there are definitely, like, I don't want to spoil events, but there are a number of really notable betrayals in this volume, either of expectation or just characters outright betraying each other, either implicitly or feeling it. And so volume 9 is basically the betrayals volume. It's real wild, some of the stuff that happens. And of course, like, most of it is utterly guileless, which is half the problem, is that characters will be like, but why did you feel betrayed? It's like, because you betrayed me, you fuck. Like, you did a bad thing. Oh, I guess I did. Shit. So yeah, you get, but man, is it, oh, it's pretty. Some stuff happens that definitely made me suck in air through my teeth and go, "Oh God, this is bad." So yeah, we'll see. There's a lot where the volume ends is in a really intense place. So have to wait for volume 10. So moving on to the main part of our show today is our various picks, and mine was the J Novel Club published light novel I Saved Too Many Girls and Caused the Apocalypse, volume 1. It's a rather storied sort of light novel series. It goes on for 16 volumes and is now in fact all complete and translated if you want to dive in. One of the reasons I picked it is because the first volume was free to quote unquote buy and add to your library on Bookwalker. So I figured, let's go for it. And so announced that. And we sort of burned through it. It's authored by Nemeko Joroshi, I believe. My screen's a little far away from here. And illustrated by Nao Watanuki. And it has one of these other slightly annoying things in light novels where it puts all the colour pages at the start, which you can understand why they do it for page count and printing purposes, but it makes it kind of annoying when you see weird spoilery events from the future of the volume right at the start, without any context, especially when you're first starting the series. So, whoops. But anyway, so this series, which I'm not going to announce the name of again because it's too long, stars Reka Namidare. I'm probably mispronouncing that, apologies. But he is a very boring dude. He likes a boring life. He wants to be kind of left alone. He's not averse to things happening or people doing stuff, but he just wants an easy life. Like, he doesn't really want anything special. But then on the day before his 16th birthday, his dad says, yep, here, son, you're part of a special bloodline, and from 16 until 18, loads of wacky ass shit is going to happen to you, and that's just the way it goes. Due to a weird imbalance of the universe, you're going to end up being like a protagonist in loads of stories and character events that are just kind of foisted upon you because you're the kind of almost the character of last resort for trials and tribulations and basically light novel plot lines. So he is the pitch hitter protagonist in all these storylines that happen. And next day, 16th birthday, he wakes up and a small girl in a train hat shows up, and she floats about 5 meters away from him at all times, called R, and that's her name. And she says, oh, by the way, hi, I'm from the future. Check it out. I guess you've heard about your bloodline. By the way, you're going to cause a war that's going to destroy all of existence in a few years. So what I need you to do is, in your journey through these different storylines, I need you to nut up and choose a heroine and, get with her and not be a massive milquetoast twit. And so Rekka Namidare then gets himself embroiled in 3 separate storylines with a space alien princess, his childhood friend who is actually an omniscient mage, and the third one. Oh, he also gets summoned to an alternative fantasy world with a demon lord, and the summoner girl who summoned him, Harissa, is also under pain of possible death because he's been summoned and not done jack. And so these 3 stories exist in line. You have the space princess who's about to be married to some Vogon-ass slug man thing who wants to blow up the universe. His childhood friend who, again, has that special magic. And so a guy called Messiah is chasing after her to snog her and so get her ability because of storyline reasons. There's like a plot dump on literally page 1 that explains how the magic works, which is probably the most sort of clangy part of this volume, where it has to basically info dump you on this storyline when it could have picked another one. In fact, if one thing about this series does, is that it has a bunch of individual prologues for each character, which are a pretty stodgy way of starting the volume off when you just want to get into it. And if anything, it's because it's 3 different very start beginnings of these storylines. It's like, well, can you get on with it and start, please, rather than giving me 3 separate parallel info dumps. And so basically Rekka ends up getting embroiled in these 3 different things, and because he keeps getting pulled from pillar to post, these are not serially occurring, they're parallel. All 3 storylines start falling over each other, they start getting intermingled. He's pulled from pillar to post, quite literally, and he has to try and resolve these sort of problems and storylines and make sure the world or universe or his childhood friend don't get blown up in the process, which he manages to do, mostly through finagling his way around it, because he has absolutely 0 special powers of his own, although he ends up getting a lot of helpful gizmos from his various new harem participants. And by the end, all 3 of the heroines are falling over him, and he's like, oh, I don't get it. What's the big problem here? Blah. And he is sort of unobtainium levels of dense when it comes to even having a character who is floating 5 meters away from him going, hey, motherfucker, pick one of them, you idiot. And he is not. So, and that's the end. That's where volume 1 kind of ends. I must admit, that was a bit of a long description, but I quite enjoyed the book. After the initial prologue sort of dump, it keeps up a very rapid pace, and if anything, it moves very swiftly, like A to B to C to D to A to B to C to D, and it kind of bam, 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 just gets through everything at a pace which is quite refreshing. The book itself on my e-reader came out to about 150 pages, which is kind of just the right length, so it doesn't outstay its welcome, and each storyline gets just enough fleshing out, and all the characters get their own little charming moments to kind of beguile you. But also, it then, of course, takes all 3 separate storyline strands, wraps them up with a bow, and even plays with some of your expectations and tropes of the genres that it's mashing together, which, it makes it kind of a pleasant, it both knows what it is and plays with that at the same time of yes, this is all light novel schlock, but I've got you here, and I'm going to have fun with this. So it kind of bams through all the individual storylines, and even from this first volume, you look at it and you go, well, the amount of girlfriends he ends up with is not stated, and there's a quite easy out to most of this. So this is quite obviously written from the start to not just be a 1-volume storyline, but something that could go on as long as the author fancies doing it until they want to resolve it, and then they can just end it immediately by having him snog someone. So that could quite easily solve the problem. But yeah, I quite enjoyed it as a result. It's definitely very easy to binge read and just very lightly just burn your way through, especially if you're in transit or on a train. You can quite easily open it and just blitz straight through it. But yeah, so as a result, I quite liked it in the end, as schlocky as it was, frankly. But so I've talked far too much. So Andy, what did you think of this thing I forced upon you?
Yeah, I mean, it's not bad. That's for sure. I mean, we're already kind of we're almost at that point where kind of the tail of the worm is wrapped around on kind of like parody isekai stories to the points where they're kind of becoming serious again. But like this is kind of an entertaining one. I mean, I feel like it has some really great moments. Kind of, it's definitely one of those kind of volumes where I found myself kind of reading through it and feeling my interest in it starting to lull, and then it kind of drops a moment that's kind of a real banger and kind of like got me engaged again for a while. Like, I mean, especially when it comes to kind of Rekka actually having to solve problems, like, you know, there's a whole like defeat the demon lord part in it, which is like really fun and smart and actually really well written. Like, that was probably like my highlight of this volume.
I think especially the after effects of that, when he's quote unquote done the deed, but no one believes him.
Yes, yeah, like all that stuff plays really well, but like even kind of like the act itself is just a pretty smart kind of like mashing together of all the kind of, you know, various things that he's gone through up to that point that has actually just by happenstance given him exactly what he needs to kind of defeat this demon lord. And it's really enjoyably written, and it's really kind of sharp and snappy in terms of kind of its dialogue and how the whole thing plays out. And like that was definitely kind of a moment where I'd almost dropped off of it kind of entirely and was just kind of reading through it just because, and then that was like, okay, like this is, now I see what this can do, and it kind of like repeats that trick like at the end of this volume, you know, kind of there's a final battle against Messiah, and like that again is very similar, and it's kind of really satisfying because it just pulls together all of the various ideas into a kind of like almost MacGyver-esque solution to the problem of just like, I've got all these weird, like this weird confluence of things going on. I can somehow kind of like jimmy all of this together into an actual way of defeating this like powerful foe that otherwise is kind of unbeatable. And like those moments were really enjoyable to me. I mean, I think on kind of the negative side, the biggest problem that this series has is that when you have a milquetoast protagonist, they are just a boring protagonist, and I totally get that there's kind of a comedy value to that initially, but when that is still your main character that you're following the entire time, that gets old pretty quickly. Like, I think, I mean, we talked about it on a previous show, but kind of one of the smartest things that Do You Love Your Mum and her 2-hit multi-target attacks does is that it kind of almost sidelines the protagonist in you know, in preference of his mum, and like that's actually like the smartest thing that series does is like, yeah, here's your dull kind of like everyday normal kid, but like he's totally gonna get usurped and kind of sidestepped by other characters pretty much every step of the way.
Every single other character.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of works. Whereas here, you don't really have that. Like, it's very much kind of like, oh, Rekka has to kind of resolve all these problems and save all these poor heroines who are actually pretty powerful in their own rights, but somehow are kind of utterly useless in the specific circumstances they've been dealt. And like that's, I think, the part where I kind of struggled with it, because, yeah, like you say, Rekka is completely kind of clueless as to all the kind of female attention around him, and a lot of the time he is just kind of, you know, waxing and waning of kind of like, oh, what should I do? You know, I want to save this girl, but I also need to save this girl, and oh no, and it's, you know, that stuff didn't really play so well for me. So I certainly vacillated on it. Like, I feel like my overall impression at the end was like, yeah, you know, I had a pretty decent time with it, but it does drag in places simply because it leans so hard into kind of the tropes of the genre, which it clearly, like, it's doing from a knowing kind of self-aware place, but it doesn't change the fact that those things are still what they are, and it doesn't really find enough to do with it always to make that worthwhile.
Yeah, I think my point of view, that all the tropey stuff I'm kind of down with, apart from Rekka himself. Like, you've kind of risen up in me, like, the fact that you're entirely correct in that he's a really annoying confluence of irritating protagonist garbage, where he wants a normal life, but then he breaks that rule when he does all this stuff. But equally, like, he has been directly told to his face, don't be a bystander to this. You're going to cause the war that annihilates existence, like the big war. You need to actually nut up and pick a heroine, and that's kind of all you need to do, and then most of this shit will stop. which is the easy outlet valve for the author in case they get told, hey, last volume, we're done with you. Like, so he can quite easily have him snog anyone, and be done with the entire series. But it makes it irritating when he has been told directly by like someone from the future to his face, you are going to cause the apocalypse that's mentioned in the title. This is your fault, dude. So that's kind of the exhausting part where he's like, I better be careful. So-and-so might get jealous. Oh, why is so-and-so jealous? He vacillates wildly between knowing that he is both doing this stupid harem thing and then being oblivious to the fact that he is the harem protagonist. Like, he operates both spaces in parallel, like almost like Newspeak-ish, where he knows he is the harem protag, but then is wondering why everyone's hanging around. And it's like, motherfucker, this is your fault. So...
Yeah, and it also, I think, feels like a bit of a missed opportunity. And this maybe, again, comes from something else that we've read previously on this show, which was like, was it all routes lead to doom, blah, blah, villainess, something or other, which is, it kind of plays with a similar idea of like putting in place kind of a clueless protagonist who is aware of kind of the circumstances that, that is going to lead to their demise. And then, by trying to work their way out of that problem, they create like a million other problems. And like that's a far more interesting kind of use of that setup, where you actually take that character and, play with it in a different way, rather than just having the kind of like, completely clueless, even though you've been told like a million times what the stakes are and what the issue at hand is, and yet you still just kind of barrel through not making the choice that would fix all of these problems instantly.
Yeah, even when you have said time traveling girl literally floating 5 meters away from you saying, hey, motherfucker, like, it's really wild.
Yeah, and let's be honest here. Like, floating time traveling girl is also the best girl as well. So the solution to the problem is literally right in front of you. Just hang out with R, because she seems kind of cool.
I don't know. She kind of rules herself out from the get go, which is the weird part when she's like, "Oh, I'm 3 years old. I was born in a vat," and I'm like, "This is weird."
It's light novels. It's fine.
Yeah. I mean, so for a peek behind the curtain, I thought, I wonder what Volume 2 will do with this premise, because Volume 2 of the light novel is normally the one that lets you know whether it's actually going to be good or if it's going to repeat stuff. And of course, the weird thing about this series is that the entire setup is that it's going to repeat with different heroines and different storylines. And so, it kind of has a weird get out clause for the whole, oh, you're doing the same thing, but with the names changed, because that's the whole point in Raison d'etre. It's just that the characters have changed and how it gets merged together at the end is different. And so Volume 2, I must admit, is slightly more bearable in that not every character he walks into becomes an immediate part of the harem, and the characters themselves are a bit more divergent in their sort of situations. And there's even a really funny bit when he gets turned into a magical girl, so you get to see a full-page photo of Rekka as a magical girl, which was pretty funny. But yeah, it's the same sort of idea of 3 more heroines, 3 more sort of storylines, and 1 more member of the bowl, I suppose. So Volume 2 continues to be good, but it is a sort of thing where I'm reading it going, yeah, I know exactly how this is going to play and the setup and the execution, but it's still interesting to see that it's like a very advanced version of Mad Libs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that is kind of interesting, because again, going back to Do You Love Your Mum, blah blah blah, like having watched the anime adaptation of that feels, at least from the adaptation, very much like a series that kind of runs out of steam after its first volume. Like, it has its smart idea, it has its fun with it, but then once you have to kind of recycle and reuse that idea in various different setups, it never quite kind of manages to recapture that magic. Like, every subsequent arc just feels like a slight kind of downward slope of like, yeah, I've kind of seen this before, and yes, you're putting a different spin on it, but that in itself isn't enough to kind of continue to make this interesting. So at least it does sound like this series has kind of the potential to vary things up a bit, to at least the point of kind of keeping the baseline interest.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that makes the second volume more interesting is you have both. It's not just it wipes all the previous characters out. Like, they're still around and they're still putting their elbows in, both for good and for ill, which makes it interesting. Although you can imagine that by volume 10 or something, there might be way too many characters involved. So hopefully they winnow them down at some point. But yeah, I mean, it's especially for the price of free. It was an enjoyable romp on a train journey, quite easy to blitz through because it's not that long, and also the prose is quite unchallenging. So it was an interesting read. Like I must admit, having read 2 volumes now, I'm not that keen on picking up the rest of them. I mean, the fact that there's an actual end point and it is finished and fully translated has me slightly interested, just because I want to know what happens at the end. But I might just ask my light novel correspondent and Patreon supporter to ask what happens at the end.
Yeah, this also feels like it's probably a series where you could actually just read the final volume, and you'll kind of be able to fill in the gaps in terms of what's happened. So yeah, that seems fair.
Yeah, like I say, you could probably end this in like 10 pages if you needed to. Just this happened, right, done, bye. So if the wheels ever came off the gravy train, you could totally end it quite quickly. But yeah, that's I Saved Too Many Girls and Caused the Apocalypse. You can get it both on ebook, and I believe it's coming to physical books at some point. But you can also read it on JNovel Club, obviously. But yeah, that's that. So Andy, how about your let's say very interesting pick for this episode?
Yeah, boy, I picked one, didn't I?
You sure did. You sure did.
I mean, I kind of at least partly knew what I was getting into here. But so my pick for this show is Super Dimensional Love Gun, which is an anthology of short stories from Shintaro Kago, who is an artist best known for what is widely termed as Elo Gulo, rather, which is kind of a very much a mix of sex and very gratuitous and gory kind of carving up of bodies, etc., etc. So I was steeled somewhat for what was to come. But yeah, I guess like right off the bat, just like content warnings for pretty much anything that anyone might find objectionable. Like, this is a series that features rape, sexual assault, abortion, lots of body horror, and as mentioned, kind of carving up of bodies, etc., etc. Like, if you are in any way kind of not into any of that stuff, or kind of, are uncomfortable with it, this is definitely not a book that you should read. And so, yeah, it's basically a collection of 15 different short stories by Kago, and I guess if you wanted to kind of like pare it down into any one kind of theme, it's really kind of effectively about kind of looking at kind of the human body, and I guess people's kind of psyche and their view of the human body and kind of the human form, and the taking those weird proclivities to their kind of illogical conclusion. Like a lot of the stories, and I feel like a lot of the better stories in this collection are very much kind of taking pretty mundane things that are kind of the good example that I would take that's probably kind of one of the better quote unquote stories here is like, everybody knows that if you get an itch, it feels good when you scratch it.
Oh,
and
God, why did you have to talk about that one?
But it like takes that to its very gruesome conclusion of like, hey, here's something that is pleasurable in a weird way, and it just goes like all in on that whole concept and just runs with it to a ridiculous degree. And that is kind of like the template for most of these stories. Like, they take a pretty simple idea or a topic for discussion and then just goes with it at a million miles an hour until it hits a brick wall and kind of splatters everywhere. And I mean, I find it, I guess like this book is more interesting from an artistic perspective in a sense than it is as a manga. Like, none of the stories here are particularly kind of, interesting in their own right. It's like there are one or two that kind of like manage to find sort of a vein of humor or something along those lines that you can dig into. But like, I feel like this does feel like you're looking at kind of an art exhibit or art installations, and it kind of becomes far more about trying to kind of look at this work and kind of ponder what the artist is saying, or kind of the thought processes behind it, than it is in terms of like, oh, this is an interesting story because of character X, or the things that they do. Like, it's a strange thing to read because it is very clearly a series of traditional manga stories, but unlike kind of other anthologies that we've covered on this show, where, you know, you can talk through each story in turn and say, oh, you know, this is what was good or this was not bad about this. Like, this to me was very much like walking up to a bunch of art exhibits and saying like, oh yeah, okay, like the artist's intent here is interesting because X, or I guess this is commentary on Y. And, you know, it's a very different kind of thing to look at. And I found myself kind of reading it almost in a sort of slightly detached way, I guess partly because of the content going in some of the directions that it does, but also because of that sense that it's something that's there to be kind of critiqued and analysed rather than something to be kind of enjoyed. Like, I don't know if that's kind of my weird I did an art A-level take on it, or whether you kind of, what your experience with it was.
Well, I got a B GCSE in art, and no, I think I'm with you. I'd say that definitely it's the purpose of the manga in this volume is not so much to get engaged with the manga, but almost to remain above it and to view it as a thought experiment. That was the thing that came in my notes multiple times in between the, frankly, waves of nausea. Don't try and marathon this if you're in any way squeamish. And I'm a squeamish person. I still have to hide behind the bloody cushion at casualty of all bloody things. But it's basically a series of thought experiments and, as you say, taking things to the logical extent. And it's like when you have that friend at university who down the pub just takes his ideas too far until you have to basically elbow them and say, hey, knock it off. So, like, also the other thing is that it always starts from a moderately sort of sensible place, and then even by panel 2 or 3, it's already accelerating out of the blocks. The note I've got in my notes here is it goes from A to D to Z and then into different alphabets and then to like epsilon or something. Like, it's already off to the races and it's kind of just about taking you with it. And it does feel like a series of almost like art films you might see at an exhibition, like in Tate Modern. You know, you see like, oh, this is a treatise on telephone wires. And it's like, oh, okay, wild. But then there is something there if you're willing to both read the actual manga but then also see what it's getting at. Like, there are several, like the if anything, the titular superdimensional love gun story is the one that is the most straightforwardly structured in that it has an actual story arc and then ends in a really weird sort of flat moment of an advert for said superdimensional love gun. I feel like the one thing this series, this anthology does in particular is it has a very like po-faced ending to most of the stories or the concepts, where it will end usually on like a wry joke or just a case of showing you the logical extension of what it's been talking about, like with the itching storyline you mentioned. But yeah, as you mentioned, like content warning on some of these. There was one, I think it was Collection Loss, which was the one that heavily features abortion, that was kind of the one that actually made me feel quite unwell, because it's just, you know, it's almost like the actual use of the phrase just asking questions. It's actually just, it's thinking about this concept it's set up, but it's gone in such a crazy direction that it then drags in everything else. And like I say, it's like a constant rolling thought experiment combined with art film. And also the one thing about it is that, like, Shintaro Kago in general, like, his art is not like ugly, but is very, like, in fact it's very detailed and very careful with, like, there's no screen tone, it's all line work, careful use of shading and tone, and also quite hewing to anatomy, which helps especially when you've got dismembering going on and such like. But Shintaro Kago in particular is very much of almost like deadpan style of drawing, where it's like, oh, this character has, you know, their leg cut off, so I better draw that properly. And it's like, oh, you know, it kind of avoids the sort of grotesquerie and luridness by being so like flat-faced about the whole thing, really.
Yeah, like it's very matter-of-fact and clinical about all of that stuff, which I think
clinical is the
word.
You got it in one, I would say. Definitely.
Yeah, like that's actually kind of, I think, what kind of lends that imagery a lot of its power, because it's sort of, it would be easy to create a version of a lot of these stories that was trying to, or that was being very overt in saying like, oh, hey, look at the shock value of this, or the titillation of it, or, you know, whatever it was going for. Whereas this, it presents everything in a very kind of flat, you know, it kind of, it feels like you're reading a very weird like IKEA manual or something, because it's all just very kind of matter of fact of like, yep, this is what happens in this panel and this is what happens in this panel, and it kind of, I guess this is kind of the part of sort of what makes it work as a sort of artistic or kind of thought experiment, because it very much leaves the kind of how you feel about it up to you. Like, it's kind of not really trying to influence you one way or the other to say like, here's what you should feel in this particular panel. Like, it's almost having talked about like Our Dreams at Dusk as a very weird comparison point. Like, that is a series that employs its imagery to tell you a lot about how you should be feeling in any given moment, whereas this is the exact opposite, where it tells you nothing about how you should feel and kind of leaves you to evaluate that for yourself, and then how you feel about what you feel about that panel is kind of like another layer down of that discussion of like, wait, shouldn't I feel worse about this, or you know, whatever it might be. And you know, I think that is what makes it interesting. And I do, again, from that kind of artistic standpoint, like, I do have sort of a fascination with the weirdness of the human mind as it relates to the human body. Like, I do find it fascinating that you know, the fetishes that people can have, and kind of the way people can think about, you know, their own bodies and other people's bodies, and you know, all of that stuff. And there is something interesting in seeing somebody just going all in on that. And you know, it's not something that I say, oh yeah, read this because it's really entertaining, but like, you know, it is kind of a weirdly fascinating thing. I mean, in terms of kind of like other sort of, you know, more Western influences, it kind of in parts reminds me of kind of stuff like Chuck Palahniuk's writing, where, you know, it very much goes in some similar directions in terms of like, oh yeah, here's this weird thing and I'm just gonna just go all in on this stuff. And like, you know, it's certainly stuff that I've seen before elsewhere, but like not depicted in the degree that this particular volume does it.
Yeah, I feel like the one thing that Chuck Palahniuk does that kind of puts it sideways of this work is that it often has a character, usually the protagonist character, who is the one sensible person who is reacting quote unquote normally to the situation, that has very quickly taken them along for a very weird ride. I think there was one of his books I read called Diary, which was extremely upsetting, because just an entire structure of an entire cosmology of pain and suffering is inflicted upon this protagonist character for a very flat reason of just, oh, we need to keep the money flowing. It's like, what the but yeah, I think the one thing, as you say, like, and like sort of looking at what the work is and your reaction to the work, and even interrogating that and your reaction, is very powerful with Kago's work. And especially because I feel like the one thing he raises in particular is the line between like the profane and the sacred. Like, nothing is sacred, nothing is profane. Everything's just on a flat plane. It's not there to like go, oh look, gore. It's more just, yes, this person has gore because they cut themselves for weird reason X. That is a thought experiment I have taken to its logical conclusion. Like, there's one story about a girl who is basically collecting all the things that the boy she likes touches, which I feel like in the end it kind of comes a cropper, because it tries to find a way to end itself in a comedic fashion, and it ends up with her arguing with her dad about starting and never finishing collections. But that entire storyline goes some really dark places, and if you are following Kago's train of thought, you can see it from the get-go, and you think, oh, maybe it won't go that far. Oh no, it's gone that far. Crap, this is kind of disgusting. So.
Yeah, and again, I think that's some of the interesting stuff in this volume that's clearly kind of, you know, putting a very weird lens to kind of, you know, consumerism and society as a whole. Like, I mean, the very first story in this volume is kind of, you know, poking fun at kind of, you know, idol culture and the idea of kind of perfection and beauty, and kind of, you know, basically holding that up as a manufactured conceit, like, you know, that's kind of actually pretty strong sort of starting block to the whole book. And then, yeah, like you say, you know, the whole kind of collection thing is pretty obviously kind of, you know, a dig at sort of, you know, consumer culture and the way, you know, people are kind of, you know, bought into this idea of having to obsessively collect things, and again just taking it to a very unnatural kind of conclusion. So, you know, some of that stuff is kind of like on the nose on one level, but then, you know, it does have a lot of other stuff to work with as well. But yeah, like some of that stuff also then does become kind of uncomfortable in some of these stories, because again, the abortion one you mentioned, like I felt like I was getting a read that I was not particularly happy with about what the surface level kind of, you know, discussion that the artist was having on that one. And like, there are definitely a couple of stories in here where I'm kind of like, is this, if you're saying what I think you are kind of on a baseline level, I'm not really into that. So there are definitely, like, it's definitely not one of those things where you can nod along and be like, oh yes, I agree with what you're saying on all of these, because some of them feel like they're kind of contentious when you dig into them.
Yeah, some of the storylines, I mean, especially because most of the characters are, like, you know, pretty girls, which is one of the things that's called out in the title, like in the actual front page. But sometimes it's like, oh, you're either making an actual point here that's just dressed up in very shocking attire, or you're just a misogynist, and this is all a cover for you being weirdly misogynistic with a weird point attached, which is kind of undercut by the fact that you are doing this like quite intense violence on people, like fake people obviously in a storyline, but then it's like, oh, this is quite easily one step away from just being out and out misogynist, because of those are the characters you are using for this lens.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of one of the problems that I kind of wrestled with as I got deeper and deeper into this book, is that when I kind of saw what seems to be the kind of the worldview of some of these stories, kind of then started to creep into and colour some of the others, where, you know, it started to kind of change my perception, as you say, to be like, wait, is this just you being misogynist, or kind of, you know, having some very strange kind of opinions on women as a whole. And yeah, like, again, it's part of what makes it interesting, because, you know, it is something that, you know, you could write a book about this stuff, but at the same time, yeah, there are certainly, I reached a point after some of those stories where I kind of started to look back at my notes and kind of what I'd already read and been like, maybe there's another read to this that I am less comfortable with. And yeah, like, it's interesting, but yeah, it is also kind of a little discomforting when you kind of reach that point and think, maybe a lot of this is being overthought, and actually maybe what you're actually saying in some of these stories is far less kind of salubrious than we might have otherwise hoped.
Yeah, I think the main thing is as we talked about before, like, this is definitely an interesting read if you can stomach it, but also is interesting to like keep several levels of thinking cap on, of thinking about your own process and what you think about it, which is perhaps almost the most interesting part of it, is just the multiple tiers of like what is being said here, like what's going on. So yeah, but at the same time it is quite trying to read. As I say, don't read it in one block, because that will wear you out. Something fierce. Yeah,
for sure. Like, I mean, I read it all en masse, and, you know, I'm very much not a squeamish person. As long as you stay away from the eyes, then I get squeamish. But like, yeah, even here there were points where I was just like, oof, this is this is quite a lot. And yeah, like, you know, it is very much on the absolute kind of knife edge, with no pun intended, of kind of, you know, of what is kind of what most people can stomach, I suspect, because yeah, it really does go places.
Yeah, I think the biggest saving grace for many of the stories is that I think the longest is like 16 or 18 pages. Like, it kind of, you know, a few of the stories perhaps outstay their welcome by a grand total of 1 or 2 pages, but they're not part of like an overarching sort of concept. It's just short, sharp jabs. I think one of the more interesting and sort of weird ones at the end, which actually kind of goes to a negative space almost, is Invis, which is a grand total of 7 pages and was an interesting concept set up in 2 pages. then like a weird storyline, and then an even stranger denouement at the last page, and it's like, wait, what does this mean? Like, this is a weird this is a weird point to end on.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of like a really good example of sort of interesting conceit that makes you think about a whole bunch of things that then kind of turns into school playground joke at the end. Like I feel like I've heard this kind of like as some kind of dirty joke when I was a kid somewhere, and it's like, again, like you say, a lot of these stories seem to struggle with their ending in that way, where it tries to kind of laugh it off at the end, and sometimes that works, but sometimes it also doesn't, and you're like, I feel like maybe you've kind of done down some of the interesting things that you initially brought up with this whole conceit.
Yeah, because quite more often than not, the tenor of the ending is someone making an armpit fart noise, and it's like, well, that doesn't work all the time, dude. You can't just make an armpit fart noise for every storyline. It works more than it works surprisingly often, but not always.
Yeah, indeed.
But yeah, so that's I'm kind of all spoken out. I mean, as I say, like, the one thing as I say about Kago's art is that he's clearly a person of some talent in drafting, but also is extremely like strict on his. It's also the fact that like a lot of it seems extremely freehand, and so, you know, characters will look slightly off kilter, which suits the slightly demented style of it all well. But, you know, it's very sort of loose and sort of slightly sweaty, I suppose, is the way I put it.
Yeah, but it's definitely like, you know, this is very much on the kind of list of like, I'm glad I read this, and like, again, kind of looking at it mostly just from an artistic point of view. You know, I think it is an interesting work, but, you know, if you're just looking for something to entertain you, and certainly if you're looking for something to read on the train, no, not this one.
Yeah, I'm glad I don't have a physical version of this that my mum might accidentally find and then immediately faint. I mean, to be fair, she'd probably laugh at half of it because she's totally fine with gore, but yeah, I mean, I think it's, at the very least, I'm glad that something of Kago's is available. I mean, other things have been released by Kago, like Dementia 21, and when he was doing a zine, I forget the name of it, he was also out on Kobo and Kindle and such, and so it's nice to see an easily digestible part of his works available, like, rather than trying to publish one of his long-running series, which would probably be quite a big ask and a lot to stomach, both from the publisher and reader point of view. I think having a series of like thought experiment, like grab you and run one-shots is probably the easiest thing you can release of his oeuvre that is easy to get in people's hands and go, hey, this is kind of a collection. And like, and also one thing of note is that at the end of the book there's the author's notes, and a lot of it is just like almost like the writing equivalent of a shrug of like, yeah, I guess I wrote this thing. So yeah, kind of weird.
Yeah. I mean, I forget which story it was, but there's one in particular that I kind of enjoy. It's like, this porn magazine like asked me to make a manga for them, but they didn't tell me that it didn't have to be gross and weird, so I just made my usual stuff. Yeah. And it's like you kind of you suspect there's some kind of commissioning editor there that just got fired from that magazine instantly. It's like, oh no, I made a terrible mistake.
Or the commissioning editor got one over on his boss and was like, owned. Check out this shit. Yeah. But yeah, but certainly very engaging. It will not leave you indifferent, is the phrase, I believe.
yes, I think that's the one for the back of the book.
Yeah. So yeah, that's unless you had anything else, Andy, that's Super Dimensional Love Gun.
No, I think that's it from me on that one.
Cool. So moving on, what we're going to be reading for next episode. So this is another case where something I was thinking about putting on the list has been stolen by Andy. So Andy, what have you picked for us?
So around the time we'll be recording and releasing our next podcast would have been the birthday of Satoshi Kon, the incredibly talented anime director who's also a manga artist. And so I picked Satoshi Kon's Opus for the next show, which I have. It's a rarity for me because it's actually something that I have read before, but I've been dying to talk about it for ages, and commemorating Mr. Kon's birthday seemed like as good a time as any to do it. Yeah,
we talked about this manga on a previous podcast we were on, and even back then I promised I'd read the damn thing, so you've got me dead to rights this time, Hanley.
Fantastic.
And I have picked something a little more mundane. It is the manga called Queen Bee, which is actually quite a new thing. It's just come out. It's so far 1 volume. It's a romantic comedy where the main character basically looks really, really scary, and she decides she would like to try and confess to the boy she likes, and things go badly, but then very well. So hooray! I quite like it because it's mostly told from the girl's point of view, and I kind of like this whole awkward romance sort of angle to it. So we're reading volume 1 of that. Cool. So moving on to the Closedown, we have a website, Screentone.club. I have recently updated our list of series we have read to also include the Returning Champions links, so check that out from the site. If you like the podcast, please consider telling a friend. That's really the easiest and best way that podcasts grow and people find out and listen, which would be really lovely. As a quick note, Andy and I will both be at Hibanicon, which actually I think has nearly finished selling out. So maybe grab one of the last few tickets if you want to come see a live version of the podcast. I probably should have been pimping that months ago. Whoops. But yeah, if you fancy, come along and you can bug us in person. It'll be fun. We're not scary, I promise. You can find us on Twitter at Screentone Club. And also you can email us at show@screentone.club. As mentioned before, someone has actually emailed us, but I haven't read the email yet. I've been too scared. And also, as mentioned, this is going to be releasing on the 1st of October, hopefully. And so patrons will be on the lookout to vote again for another series for us to review in the bonus episodes. Personal plugs. My name is Elliot Page. You can find me at Elliot Page on Twitter, and I'm going to be sadly bereft of cat pictures because I am now 300 miles away from where they live. And Andy, how about you?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter at Hannah's1979.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening, and good night.
Bye, everyone.